I need someone discreet, she whispered, closing the door to her corner office. I thought I was being promoted. Instead, I was being propositioned. When I declined, things got ugly fast. What she didn't know? I was already recording. My name is Nathan Duong, and at 39, I thought I had seen everything corporate America could throw at me. For 8 years, I had been the senior operations analyst at Kendrick Systems in Seattle, a mid-sized logistics software company that prided itself on efficiency and results. I was the guy they called when numbers didn't add up, when processes needed streamlining, when someone needed to dig deep into the data and emerge with actionable insights. My colleagues knew me as reliable, professional, and perhaps most importantly, discreet. In a company where office politics could make or break careers, I had earned a reputation for keeping my head down and my mouth shut. Kendrick Systems operated like many traditional corporate structures, with layers of management that seemed to multiply each quarter. The company had been growing rapidly, acquiring smaller firms and expanding into new markets. With growth came new faces, new ambitions, and new dynamics that I watched from my analytical perch, with the same detachment I applied to spreadsheets and quarterly reports. The office buzzed with the usual mixture of deadline stress and water cooler gossip. Our floor occupied 3 levels of a gleaming downtown building with views of Elliott Bay. The executive suites were on the top floor. Naturally, while us worker bees occupied the middle tier, I had a corner cubicle, which was something of a status symbol among the analysts, though it came with the added burden of being visible to anyone walking the floor. That visibility would prove to be both a blessing and a curse when Alicia Brent entered my professional life like a Category 5 hurricane disguised as a refreshing spring breeze. Alicia was 36, impeccably dressed, and carried herself with the kind of confidence that made boardrooms pay attention. She had been hired as our new regional strategy director for the West Coast, a position that had been vacant for months after the previous director left under circumstances that were never fully explained to those of us below the executive level. The announcement of her appointment came with the usual fanfare glowing credentials, impressive track record at previous companies, and the promise that she would be a game changer for our division. Her first week was a whirlwind of meetings, presentations, and the kind of strategic vision casting that made executives feel important and left everyone else wondering what it actually meant for their daily work. I attended 2 of her presentations to the operations team, where she outlined ambitious growth targets and spoke about leveraging human capital in innovative ways. She had a polished delivery, the kind that suggested expensive business school training, and she made eye contact with everyone in the room in a way that made you feel like she was speaking directly to you. After the second presentation, she approached me directly. I was packing up my laptop, preparing to return to the endless stream of logistics optimization reports that comprised my actual job, when I felt a presence beside me. Excellent questions during the presentation. Nathan, she said, extending a perfectly manicured hand. Alicia Brent. I don't think we've been formally introduced. I shook her hand, noting that she held the contact a moment longer than necessary. Nathan Duong, operations analysis. Thanks for the presentation. Some interesting concepts. She smiled, and I noticed she had positioned herself slightly closer than the typical professional distance. I'd like to hear more of your thoughts sometime. Perhaps we could schedule a one-on-one to discuss how your analysis work might align with some of the strategic initiatives I'm developing. That seemed reasonable enough. One-on-ones with senior leadership weren't uncommon, especially when new executives were trying to understand the capabilities of their teams. We scheduled a meeting for the following Thursday at 5:30, which she explained would give us time to talk without the usual office interruptions. The meeting was set for Conference Room C, one of the smaller rooms with a view of the city. When I arrived, I found Alicia already there, but instead of the usual stack of papers and laptop setup I expected, she had a bottle of red wine and 2 glasses on the table. I thought we might make this a bit less formal, she said, gesturing to the wine. Sometimes the best strategic conversations happen when people can relax a little. I sat down, declining the wine politely and pulling out my notebook. She poured herself a glass and settled into the chair across from me, but angled it so she was facing me more directly than the table. Tell me about your background. Nathan, I've read your personnel file, of course. but I'm more interested in what drives you. What gets you excited about this work? For the next hour, we discussed my analysis methods, the projects I'd worked on, and my observations about inefficiencies in our current systems. It was a productive conversation, though I noticed she had a tendency to lean forward when I was speaking, maintaining intense eye contact that felt slightly more personal than professional. She also had a habit of touching my arm lightly when making a point, a gesture that seemed designed to establish intimacy. As the meeting wound down, she made an observation that should have been my first real warning sign. You know, Nathan, in my experience, the most valuable employees aren't just those who do excellent work. They're the ones who understand the bigger picture, who can be trusted with sensitive information, who can work closely with leadership on matters that require absolute discretion. She paused, swirling her wine glass, and fixed me with a look that was definitely not about quarterly reports. I'm developing a special initiative that will require someone with your analytical skills, but also someone who understands the importance of confidentiality. Someone who can work flexible hours, travel when necessary, and maintain the kind of professional relationship that goes beyond the typical manager-subordinate dynamic. I felt a chill of recognition, though I couldn't yet articulate exactly what was bothering me about her words. Something in her tone, in the way she emphasized certain phrases, suggested layers of meaning that had nothing to do with operations analysis. I'd like to think about that, I replied carefully. Could you send me more details about the initiative? She smiled, but there was something predatory in it. Of course. But Nathan, I want you to understand that opportunities like this don't come along often. The right person could find their career trajectory changed significantly. The wrong person, well, let's just say that discretion works both ways. I left that meeting with a sense of unease I couldn't shake. Over the next few weeks, I found myself increasingly in Alicia's orbit. She would stop by my cubicle to ask questions that seemed unnecessarily complex for brief hallway conversations. She invited me to lunch twice, both times to restaurants that were more upscale than the usual corporate dining spots. She began sending me emails after business hours, often with requests that could have easily waited until the next day. The emails were professionally worded, but had an undertone that made me uncomfortable. She would thank me for my exceptional attention to detail and mention how much she valued our growing professional relationship. She began signing them with just her first name, followed by a casual, "Looking forward to our next conversation." The breaking point came on a Friday evening in early November. I was preparing to leave the office when I received a text message from Alicia asking if I could stop by her office before I left. She had some urgent questions about a logistics analysis I'd completed earlier that week. Her office was on the executive floor, a corner suite with floor-to-ceiling windows and the kind of expensive furniture that suggested serious budget allocation for executive comfort. When I knocked, she called for me to come in, and I found her standing near the windows, looking out at the city lights that were beginning to twinkle in the early darkness. She had changed from her usual business suit into something more casual, a silk blouse and dark slacks that seemed more appropriate for dinner than overtime work. A bottle of champagne sat in an ice bucket on the small conference table near her desk. "Nathan," she said, turning from the window with a smile that was definitely not about logistics analysis. "Thank you for coming up. Please, have a seat." She gestured to the small seating area near her desk, 2 leather chairs separated by a coffee table. Instead of sitting behind her desk, she took the chair directly across from me, close enough that our knees were almost touching. "I wanted to discuss something with you that requires absolute confidentiality," she began, leaning forward slightly. "As you know, I've been impressed with your work, but more than that, I've been impressed with you as a person. Your professionalism, your discretion, your understanding of how business really works at the executive level." She paused, reaching for the champagne bottle. "I thought we should celebrate what I hope will be the beginning of a new phase in your career. I don't think I should drink during work hours," I said, though something told me this conversation was going to require all my faculties. She smiled, pouring 2 glasses anyway. "Nathan, what I'm about to propose goes well beyond normal work hours. In fact, it goes well beyond normal work relationships." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. I had suspected this moment was coming, but hearing her actually begin to voice it felt surreal. I'm creating a new position, one that doesn't exist in our official organizational chart. I need someone who can serve as my special executive companion, someone who can travel with me, attend evening functions, be available for weekends when needed. Someone who understands that the most important business happens outside traditional office settings. She stood up and moved to the window, but continued talking with her back to me. This isn't just about professional duties. Nathan, I'm talking about a relationship that would be mutually beneficial in ways that extend beyond typical employment arrangements. You would be compensated well above your current salary. Of course, there would be travel opportunities, access to executive-level networking, and the kind of career advancement that most people only dream about. She turned back to face me, and there was no ambiguity left in her expression or her words. What I'm offering you is the chance to be my special assistant in every sense of the phrase. Someone who can anticipate my needs, both professional and personal. Someone who understands that successful executives often require more comprehensive support than what shows up in job descriptions. The room was completely quiet except for the hum of the building's climate control system. I could feel my pulse quickening, but not from excitement, from the recognition that I was in a situation that could destroy my career no matter how I handled it. Alicia, I said carefully, I appreciate the confidence you've shown in my professional abilities, but what you're describing isn't something I'm interested in pursuing. Her expression didn't change immediately, but I caught a flicker of something surprise, perhaps, or irritation that was quickly controlled. I think you might be misunderstanding what I'm offering. Nathan, this isn't just about personal compatibility, though I believe we would work very well together in that regard. This is about career opportunities that don't exist through normal advancement channels. The kind of access to senior leadership and strategic decision-making that could set you up for executive positions yourself. She moved closer, close enough that I could smell her perfume, something expensive and subtle that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. Think about it. Nathan, you've been in the same analyst role for 8 years. You're clearly capable of more, but in traditional corporate structures, advancement can be painfully slow. What I'm offering is a shortcut, a way to leapfrog years of gradual promotion. I stood up, putting some distance between us. Alicia, I understand what you're offering, and I'm declining. I'm not interested in that type of arrangement, professionally or personally. For a moment, her composed executive mask slipped entirely, and I saw something cold and calculating underneath. That's disappointing. Nathan, I had hoped you were more perceptive about career opportunities. I suppose not everyone has the vision to recognize when doors are being opened for them. She moved back to her desk, her demeanor shifting from intimate to coldly professional. Of course, I respect your decision. I hope you understand that my assessment of your potential may need to be revised accordingly. The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. I nodded and headed for the door, but her voice stopped me as I reached for the handle. Nathan, I trust this conversation will remain confidential. Some discussions are better kept private, for everyone's benefit. I left her office with the certain knowledge that my career at Kendrick Systems was effectively over. The only question was how long it would take and how ugly the process would become. I didn't have to wait long for an answer. The following Monday, I noticed a subtle shift in the office atmosphere. Colleagues who usually stopped by my cubicle to chat seemed busy with other tasks. The usual casual greetings felt forced, and I caught people looking away when I made eye contact. By Wednesday, I was excluded from a weekly operations meeting I had attended for 3 years. When I asked my immediate supervisor, Janet Reynolds, about it, she gave me a vague explanation about restructuring meeting dynamics and suggested I focus on my individual projects. On Friday, I received an email from Human Resources requesting a meeting first thing Monday morning. The subject line read, Employment Status Discussion, which in corporate speak was rarely good news. That weekend, I did something I had never done in 8 years of employment at Kendrick Systems. I began documenting everything. I went through my email archive, my phone, my calendar, and my notes, creating a comprehensive record of every interaction I'd had with Alicia Brent. I printed screenshots of emails, transcribed voicemails, and wrote detailed summaries of our conversations, including dates, times, and locations. I also did something else that would prove crucial later. I activated the voice recording app on my phone and began carrying it with me everywhere in the office. If this situation was going to deteriorate further, I wanted evidence of exactly what was said and by whom. The Monday morning meeting with HR was everything I expected it to be and worse. I was called into a conference room where Janet Reynolds and Miranda Walsh from Human Resources were waiting with a folder that was ominously thick for a discussion about my employment status. "Nathan," Miranda began without preamble, "we need to discuss some concerns that have been raised about your recent performance and professional conduct." I sat down, keeping my expression neutral while my mind raced. "What specific concerns?" Janet opened the folder and consulted a document. There have been reports of insubordination, failure to collaborate effectively with senior leadership, and what's been described as a confrontational attitude toward authority figures. Could you be more specific about these reports? Who made them? And what incidents are you referring to? Miranda intervened smoothly. "While we can't share specific details about personnel complaints, I can tell you that the feedback indicates a pattern of behavior that's inconsistent with Kendrick Systems' collaborative culture and professional standards. This is the first I'm hearing of any performance issues." I said, "My last review was excellent, and I haven't received any negative feedback from my direct supervisor or team members." Janet looked uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact. "These concerns have come from executive-level management, Nathan. Sometimes issues that aren't apparent at the department level become visible when viewed from a broader organizational perspective." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, but the conclusion was foregone. I was being placed on a performance improvement plan, effective immediately. The plan included regular check-ins with HR, documentation of all interactions with senior leadership, and what they termed attitude adjustment coaching with an external consultant. As I left that meeting, I understood that the performance improvement plan was simply a paper trail being created to justify my eventual termination. In companies like Kendrick Systems, PIPs were rarely about improvement. They were about building a legal case for dismissal that would withstand unemployment challenges or potential lawsuits. That afternoon, I made 2 phone calls that would change the trajectory of this entire situation. The first was to Julian Cross, a private investigator who specialized in corporate misconduct cases. I had found his name through an online search for investigators who dealt with workplace harassment and retaliation. His website was professional but not flashy, and his background as a former police detective who had transitioned into corporate investigation work seemed relevant to my situation. Julian agreed to meet with me that evening at a coffee shop in Capitol Hill, away from the downtown area where I might encounter colleagues or executives from Kendrick's Systems. He was a man in his early 50s with graying hair and the kind of direct gaze that suggested he'd heard every story and wasn't easily surprised. I spent an hour walking him through the entire situation with Alicia, the pattern of escalating inappropriate behavior, her propositions, and the immediate retaliation that followed my rejection of her advances. Julian took notes throughout my account, occasionally asking for clarification about dates, witnesses, or documentation. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment. "Nathan," he said finally, "what you're describing is a textbook case of quid pro quo sexual harassment followed by retaliation. The challenge is that these cases often come down to she said, unless there's clear evidence or a pattern of similar behavior." He pulled out a business card and slid it across the table. "I want to take this case, but I need you to understand what we're up against. Alicia Brent isn't just any manager, she's a senior executive with significant influence in the company. Fighting back against someone in her position will require substantial evidence and probably won't be resolved quietly. What kind of evidence would we need?" Julian ticked off items on his fingers. Documentation of inappropriate communications, witness testimony, records of the retaliation, and ideally, evidence that you're not the first person she's targeted this way. In my experience, people who abuse their power in these situations rarely limit themselves to one victim. He paused, studying my face. "Are you prepared for this to get ugly? Because if we move forward, it probably will. She'll deny everything. The company will protect their investment in her, and you'll likely face significant professional and personal consequences before this is resolved." I thought about that question for several days. Was I prepared for my career at Kendrick Systems to end? Was I prepared for the possibility of a lengthy legal battle, potential blacklisting in the industry, and the personal stress of going up against a well-connected executive? The answer came when I received my first weekly check-in from the Performance Improvement Plan. Miranda Walsh had scheduled a 30-minute meeting to discuss my progress in addressing the behavioral concerns that had been raised. During that meeting, she informed me that there had been additional complaints about my attitude, and that my improvement plan would be extended from the standard 90 days to 6 months. She also mentioned that I would be excluded from several upcoming projects because my current performance level made me unsuitable for high visibility assignments. As I sat in that sterile conference room, listening to Miranda recite corporate scripted language designed to push me toward resignation, I realized that my career at Kendrick Systems was already over. The only question was whether I would leave quietly or fight back. That evening, I called Julian Cross and told him I wanted to move forward with the investigation. The investigation began with what Julian called background development. He started by researching Alicia Brent's employment history, looking for patterns of complaints, lawsuits, or unusual turnover in her previous positions. What he found was revealing. Alicia had worked at 3 companies over the previous 10 years, and each position had ended with her leaving for a better opportunity, just as questions began to surface about her management style. At her previous company, Meridian Logistics, Julian discovered that 2 male employees had filed complaints with HR about inappropriate behavior from a female executive during the time frame when Alicia was in a senior management role. The complaints had been settled quietly, with both employees signing non-disclosure agreements in exchange for severance packages that were significantly larger than standard. Julian couldn't access the specific details because of the NDAs, but the timing and circumstances suggested a pattern. While Julian worked on the background investigation, I focused on documenting every interaction I had at work. The voice recording app on my phone became my constant companion, and I began keeping detailed daily logs of conversations, emails, and incidents that could be relevant to building a case. 2 weeks into this process, something happened that gave us the breakthrough we needed. I was working late one evening, trying to catch up on projects that had been complicated by my reduced access to team meetings and resources, when I received a text message from an unknown number. "Are you the guy from operations who's having problems with Alicia Brent? I heard through the grapevine that you might be dealing with some issues. If you want to talk, I might have some information that could be helpful." The message was signed M with a phone number. I showed the message to Julian the next day, and he advised me to respond cautiously. We arranged to meet M at a restaurant in Fremont, another location safely away from the downtown business district. M turned out to be Marcus Chen, a former Kendrick Systems employee who had worked in the marketing department until 3 months earlier. Marcus was about my age, professionally dressed, and had the slightly haunted look of someone who had been through a difficult workplace experience. Marcus told me that he had been approached by Alicia shortly after she started at Kendrick Systems. She had invited him to several after-hours meetings, made suggestions about special projects that would involve travel and flexible arrangements, and had made it clear that his career advancement could benefit from a closer working relationship with her. Unlike me, Marcus had initially been interested in the career opportunities she was suggesting. He had attended several evening meetings, including one at her apartment where she had made explicit propositions about the nature of their professional relationship. When Marcus realized what she was actually proposing and declined to pursue that type of arrangement, his experience had been similar to mine. Excluded from meetings, given negative performance reviews, and eventually pushed toward resignation through a combination of impossible projects and hostile work environment. The difference was that Marcus had been smart enough to recognize the pattern early. He had resigned before the situation escalated to a formal performance improvement plan, and he had been careful to frame his departure as a voluntary career change rather than a problem with management. But Marcus had also done something else that proved invaluable to our case. He had kept records, emails, text messages, notes from meetings, and most importantly, photographs of documents that Alicia had shared with him during their private meetings. Some of those documents contained information about other employees, including performance evaluations and personal information that she should not have been sharing with someone outside their reporting structure. Julian was ecstatic when he saw Marcus's documentation. Not only did it establish a clear pattern of behavior, but some of the documents Marcus had photographed contained evidence of other policy violations that could be relevant to building a broader case against Alicia's conduct. With Marcus's cooperation, we now had testimony from 2 victims, documented evidence of Alicia's pattern of inappropriate behavior, and documentation of retaliation against employees who refused her advances. But Julian wanted more. In his experience, cases like this were strongest when they demonstrated a clear pattern across multiple victims and multiple companies. He suggested that we try to locate some of the previous victims from Alicia's earlier positions. This part of the investigation took several weeks and required some creative research techniques. Julian used his network of contacts in the corporate investigation field to identify former employees of Alicia's previous companies who might have relevant information. The breakthrough came when he located David Park, a former operations manager at Meridian Logistics, who had been one of the employees who signed an NDA after filing complaints about inappropriate behavior. David was reluctant to talk initially, understandably concerned about the legal implications of discussing matters covered by his non-disclosure agreement. However, Julian was able to explain that discussing general patterns of behavior without revealing specific confidential details might not violate the terms of his agreement. David agreed to meet with us, and his story was remarkably similar to mine and Marcus's experiences: inappropriate attention from Alicia, suggestions about special assignments that involved personal as well as professional duties, and swift retaliation when he declined to participate in that type of arrangement. David also provided us with something unexpected insight into how Alicia operated at the executive level. According to David, she was skilled at building alliances with senior leadership by positioning herself as a results-oriented executive who was being unfairly targeted by disgruntled male employees who couldn't handle working for a strong female leader. This revelation was crucial because it helped us understand the strategy we were likely facing at Kendrick Systems. Alicia wasn't just denying inappropriate behavior, she was probably positioning any complaints against her as evidence of gender bias or professional jealousy. With testimony from 3 victims across 2 companies, documented evidence of inappropriate behavior, and a clear pattern of retaliation, Julian felt we had a strong enough case to move to the next phase of our strategy. That's when I made my second important phone call, this one to Sophie Tran at the Seattle Observer. Sophie was an investigative journalist who specialized in corporate misconduct and workplace abuse stories. Her articles had exposed several high-profile cases of executive misbehavior at major Seattle companies, and she had a reputation for thorough research and fair reporting. Julian had suggested that media attention might be necessary to force Kendrick Systems to take our complaints seriously. In his experience, companies were more likely to address harassment and retaliation issues when they faced public scrutiny than when they could handle complaints through internal processes that they controlled. Sophie agreed to meet with us after I sent her a detailed summary of the situation and the evidence we had gathered. She was a woman in her early 40s with short dark hair and the kind of direct questioning style that probably made corporate executives very nervous. She spent 2 hours reviewing our documentation, interviewing Marcus and me about our experiences, and asking detailed questions about our evidence and our motivations for going public with the story. At the end of the meeting, she leaned back in her chair and gave us her assessment. "This is exactly the kind of story that needs to be told," she said. "What you're describing is a pattern of abuse of power that's unfortunately common in corporate environments, but rarely gets exposed because victims are afraid to come forward." She paused, making notes in her reporter's notebook. "However, I need to be completely transparent with you about what publication will mean. Once this story runs, there's no taking it back. Alicia Brent will probably hire a crisis management firm and a legal team. Kendrick Systems will likely try to discredit you and question your motivations. And you'll probably face professional consequences that extend beyond just your current job. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny and conflict?" Marcus and I looked at each other. We had discussed this possibility extensively, and we had both concluded that the potential consequences of going public were outweighed by the importance of preventing Alicia from continuing to abuse her position with other victims. "We're prepared," I told Sophie. but we want to make sure the story is told accurately and fairly. Sophie nodded. I'll need to do additional research and verification before I can publish anything. I'll want to speak with David Park if he's willing to talk on the record. I'll also need to give Kendrick Systems and Alicia Brent the opportunity to respond to the allegations before publication. Over the next 3 weeks, Sophie conducted a thorough investigation that went beyond what Julian and I had been able to accomplish on our own. She interviewed additional former employees from both Kendrick Systems and Alicia's previous companies. She reviewed public records, corporate filings, and industry publications to understand the broader context of Alicia's career and reputation. Most importantly, she was able to locate and interview a fourth victim, a former employee of Alicia's first company who had been subjected to similar treatment, but had never filed formal complaints because he was afraid of professional retaliation. Sophie also did something that neither Julian nor I had anticipated. She researched Kendrick Systems' policies and procedures for handling harassment complaints. And she discovered that the company had received multiple complaints about various executives over the previous 5 years, but had never taken disciplinary action against any senior-level manager. This pattern suggested that our individual case was part of a broader problem with how Kendrick Systems handled workplace misconduct, particularly when it involved executives with significant influence in the company. As Sophie's investigation progressed, things at Kendrick Systems continued to deteriorate for me. My performance improvement plan had been extended again, this time with additional restrictions that made it nearly impossible for me to do my job effectively. I was excluded from team meetings, denied access to certain computer systems, and assigned to projects that were clearly designed to set me up for failure. The psychological pressure was intense. I was spending 40 hours a week in an environment where I was treated as a problem employee, where colleagues avoided me, and where every interaction felt like it might be used as evidence against me in future disciplinary actions. But I was also documenting everything. Every unreasonable assignment, every exclusion from normal work activities, every hostile interaction was recorded in my daily logs. The voice recording app on my phone captured conversations that clearly demonstrated the retaliatory nature of my treatment. 3 weeks after our first meeting with Sophie, she called to tell me that her investigation was complete and that she was ready to publish the story. She had confirmed details with multiple sources, given Kendrick Systems and Alicia Brent the opportunity to respond to the allegations, and received legal clearance from the Seattle Observer's attorneys. The first article would run on a Thursday morning, with follow-up pieces scheduled for Friday and the following Monday. Sophie explained that running the story as a series would allow her to present different aspects of the case in detail while maintaining reader attention throughout the week. On Wednesday evening, I received a call from Miranda Walsh in Human Resources, asking me to come in early Thursday morning for an urgent meeting. The timing seemed too coincidental to be unrelated to the impending publication, though I couldn't imagine how they could have learned about Sophie's investigation. I arrived at the office Thursday morning to find Miranda waiting with Janet Reynolds and a man I didn't recognize who introduced himself as Tom Bradley from the company's legal department. "Nathan," Miranda began, "we've received some concerning information that we need to discuss with you immediately." Tom Bradley took over the conversation. "We understand that you may have been in communication with members of the media regarding your employment situation here at Kendrick Systems. Is that accurate?" I felt a moment of panic, wondering if they somehow had evidence of my conversations with Sophie, but I managed to keep my voice steady. "Could you be more specific about what information you're referring to?" "Mr. Duong," Tom continued, "I need to remind you that as a condition of your employment, you signed confidentiality agreements that prohibit you from discussing internal company matters with outside parties, including journalists. Violation of those agreements could result in immediate termination and potential legal action." The meeting continued for another 15 minutes, with Tom Bradley making increasingly direct threats about the consequences of talking to reporters, while Miranda and Janet sat silently, clearly uncomfortable with the aggressive approach. I left that meeting knowing that Sophie's article was scheduled to go live online in less than 2 hours, and that my employment at Kendrick Systems would probably end before the day was over. At 10 a.m., I received a text message from Sophie with a link to the Seattle Observer's website. The headline read, "Power Play: How a Corporate Executive Used Her Position to Prey on Male Subordinates." The article was comprehensive, well-researched, and devastating. Sophie had managed to present the facts in a way that was clearly critical of Alicia's behavior while avoiding sensationalism or character assassination. She focused on the pattern of abuse of power, the failure of corporate systems to protect employees, and the broader implications for workplace culture in corporate America. The article included quotes from Marcus, David, and the fourth victim Sophie had identified, though she had used pseudonyms to protect their privacy. My case was presented in detail, including excerpts from emails and summaries of recorded conversations that clearly demonstrated both the harassment and the retaliation. Most damaging to Alicia and Kendrick's systems was Sophie's reporting on the company's response to the allegations. When Sophie had contacted them for comment, they had denied any knowledge of inappropriate behavior and had suggested that the complaints were motivated by disgruntled employees who were facing legitimate performance issues. Sophie had then presented them with specific evidence, including emails and documentation that contradicted their initial denials. Their subsequent responses became increasingly defensive and legalistic, creating the impression of a company more concerned with protecting their executive than addressing legitimate employee concerns. The response to the article was immediate and intense. By noon, it had been shared hundreds of times on social media. Local business blogs picked up the story, and by evening, it was being discussed on Seattle area news programs. I received dozens of emails and phone calls throughout the day, some from reporters seeking additional comment, others from current and former Kendrick Systems employees expressing support or sharing their own experiences with problematic management. But the most significant response came at 4:30 p.m., when I received a call from Tom Bradley asking me to return to the office immediately for another meeting. This time, the meeting included Miranda Walsh, Tom Bradley, and two additional people who were introduced as external consultants brought in to handle the situation. The atmosphere was tense and formal, with everyone seated around the large conference table in a way that made me feel like I was facing a tribunal. "Mr. Duong," Tom Bradley began, "the publication of this article represents a serious breach of your confidentiality obligations and a violation of company policy regarding public statements about internal matters." He slid a document across the table to me. "This is your termination notice, effective immediately. You're being dismissed for cause due to violations of confidentiality agreements and conduct detrimental to the company's reputation and business interests." I picked up the termination notice and read through it quickly. It was thorough, legalistic, and designed to make it difficult for me to claim unemployment benefits or pursue wrongful termination claims. "Do you have any questions about the terms of your termination?" one of the consultants asked. I looked around the table at the 5 people who were assembled to handle my dismissal, and I realized that this moment had been inevitable from the day I declined Alicia's proposition in her office. "Just one question." I said, "Where is Alicia Brent? Shouldn't she be here for this?" The silence that followed was telling. Finally, Tom Bradley responded, "Ms. Brent is dealing with other matters related to this situation. Her presence isn't required for employment termination procedures." I gathered my personal belongings under the supervision of a security guard, turned in my company laptop and access cards, and left the Kendrick Systems building for the last time as an employee. That evening, Sophie's second article was published online. This one focused specifically on Kendrick Systems' response to the allegations and their decision to terminate me immediately after the first article was published. The headline read, "Retaliation Continues. Company Fires Whistleblower Hours After Harassment. Story Breaks." The second article generated even more attention than the first. The optics of firing an employee immediately after he went public with harassment allegations were terrible for Kendrick Systems. And Sophie's reporting made it clear that the termination was retaliatory rather than based on legitimate performance concerns. By Friday morning, the story had been picked up by national business publications. The Seattle Times ran their own follow-up investigation, and several employment law attorneys had reached out to offer their services. But the most significant development came Friday afternoon, when Sophie published her third and final article in the series. This one was titled, "Pattern of Silence: How Corporate Culture Enables Workplace Predators." This article went beyond my specific case to examine the broader systemic issues that allowed executives like Alicia to abuse their positions without consequences. Sophie had interviewed employment lawyers, workplace culture experts, and other victims of corporate harassment to create a comprehensive analysis of how companies like Kendrick Systems protected problematic executives while punishing employees who tried to hold them accountable. The article also revealed something that neither Julian nor I had discovered in our investigation. Sophie had found evidence that Alicia was not the only Kendrick Systems executive who had been the subject of harassment complaints over the previous 3 years. At least 6 other senior managers had been accused of various forms of workplace misconduct, but none of those cases had resulted in disciplinary action. Instead, the pattern was consistent. Complaints were handled through internal HR processes that favored the accused executives. Victims were pressured to accept quiet settlements or face retaliation, and the executives continued in their positions while the complainants often left the company. Sophie's reporting painted Kendrick Systems as a company with a systemic problem in how it handled executive misconduct, and Alicia's case as just the most recent and visible example of a much larger cultural issue. The impact of Sophie's series was immediate and far-reaching. By Monday morning, Kendrick Systems' stock price had dropped 8%. Several major clients had contacted the company expressing concerns about the allegations and requesting information about the company's policies and procedures for handling workplace misconduct. More importantly, for my situation, the public attention had made it impossible for Kendrick Systems to handle the matter quietly through their usual internal processes. Monday afternoon, I received a call from Julian Cross with news that would change everything. "Nathan," he said, "I just got off the phone with Tom Bradley at Kendrick Systems. Alicia Brent has been suspended pending a full investigation into the allegations. They're also conducting a broader review of their harassment and retaliation policies." That was encouraging news, but Julian had something even more significant to tell me. "I also heard from David Park this morning. The publicity around your case has prompted him to contact his attorney about potentially voiding his NDA with Meridian Logistics. Apparently, there are legal grounds for challenging non-disclosure agreements when they were signed to cover up illegal behavior. If David can get out of his NDA, he's willing to go public with his story, and if that happens, it could open the floodgates for other victims from Alicia's previous companies to come forward." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal activity, media attention, and corporate crisis management. Kendrick Systems hired a major public relations firm to handle the fallout from Sophie's articles. But their initial strategy of minimizing the allegations and defending Alicia's reputation only made the situation worse. Internal documents began leaking to journalists, including emails that showed executives had been aware of complaints about Alicia's behavior, but had chosen not to investigate them thoroughly. Employee surveys revealed widespread dissatisfaction with how the company handled workplace misconduct complaints, and several current employees came forward with their own stories of problematic executive behavior. The pressure on Kendrick Systems became overwhelming when 3 major clients announced they were reviewing their contracts with the company pending resolution of the harassment allegations. The potential loss of those accounts represented millions of dollars in annual revenue, and the company's board of directors was forced to take decisive action. 2 weeks after Sophie's articles were published, Kendrick Systems issued a statement announcing that Alicia Brent had been terminated immediately for violations of company policy and professional conduct standards. The statement also announced that the company was implementing new policies for handling harassment complaints and would be conducting a comprehensive review of its workplace culture. But the most significant development came when David Park successfully challenged his NDA and went public with his story about Alicia's behavior at Meridian Logistics. His decision to speak out prompted 2 other former Meridian employees to come forward with similar allegations, and within days, Meridian Logistics announced their own internal investigation into Alicia's tenure at their company. The cascade effect was exactly what Julian had predicted. Once the first NDA was successfully challenged, other victims felt empowered to challenge their own agreements. Within a month, Alicia was facing allegations from 7 different victims across 3 companies, and all 3 companies were dealing with investigations, legal challenges, and significant reputational damage. For Alicia personally, the consequences were severe and swift. She was not only terminated from Kendrick Systems, but also faced the prospect of multiple lawsuits from former victims who were no longer bound by non-disclosure agreements. Her reputation in the industry was destroyed, and her chances of obtaining another executive position were essentially eliminated. Several employment law firms reached out to represent the growing group of victims in potential legal action against the companies that had enabled Alicia's behavior. While I was initially hesitant about pursuing litigation, Julian convinced me that holding these companies accountable was important not just for my situation, but for preventing similar abuses in the future. The legal process was complex and lengthy, but the outcome was more positive than I had dared to hope. Kendrick Systems eventually settled with me for a sum that was significantly larger than my annual salary, along with a commitment to provide positive references and remove all negative documentation from my personnel file. More importantly, the settlement included provisions that required Kendrick Systems to implement new training programs for executives, establish independent oversight for harassment complaints, and report annually on their progress in addressing workplace culture issues. But the most meaningful outcome wasn't financial or legal, it was personal and professional vindication. 3 months after my termination from Kendrick Systems, I received a phone call that would restore my faith in corporate America. The call was from Jennifer Martinez, the Chief Operating Officer of Alpine Axis, a rapidly growing logistics technology company based in Denver. Jennifer explained that she had been following the coverage of my case and was impressed not just with my professional qualifications, but with the courage I had shown in standing up to workplace misconduct despite the personal and professional costs. Alpine Axis was looking for a Senior Director of Operations Analysis, a position that would involve leading a team of analysts and working directly with executive leadership on strategic initiatives. The role came with a salary that was 35% higher than what I had been earning at Kendrick Systems, comprehensive benefits, and most importantly, a company culture that Jennifer assured me was built on respect, accountability, and ethical leadership. What made the offer even more attractive was Alpine Axis's commitment to providing me with legal insurance and support, recognizing that my willingness to speak out about workplace misconduct might make me a target for retaliation in future positions. I accepted the offer, and within 6 weeks, I was living in Denver and starting what would prove to be the most rewarding phase of my career. The move to Alpine Axis was transformative in ways I hadn't anticipated. Not only was I working in an environment where ethical behavior was genuinely valued, but I found myself becoming an advocate for workplace reform within the broader business community. I was invited to speak at conferences about recognizing and addressing workplace harassment. Employment lawyers consulted with me on other cases involving executive misconduct, and most importantly, other victims of workplace abuse reached out to me for advice and support in their own situations. One of the most meaningful connections came from a woman named Sarah Chin, no relation to Marcus, who had been subjected to harassment by a male executive at a technology company in San Francisco. Sarah had read about my case and reached out for advice on how to document inappropriate behavior and build a case for formal complaints. I was able to connect Sarah with Julian Cross and Sophie Tran, and her case eventually led to another high-profile investigation that resulted in the termination of another abusive executive. Sarah's willingness to come forward also encouraged 3 other victims at her company to speak out, leading to a comprehensive reform of their workplace policies. These connections and collaborations made me realize that my experience with Alicia Brent had been part of a much larger pattern of workplace abuse that was finally beginning to be exposed and addressed. The Not Her Me Too movement had focused primarily on sexual harassment and assault, which was critically important work. But what my case and others like it demonstrated was that workplace abuse took many forms, and that men could be victims just as women could be perpetrators. The traditional narrative about workplace harassment assumed that abusers were always men in positions of power, targeting women in subordinate roles. My experience, along with Marcus's and David's and the other victims who came forward, showed that the real issue was abuse of power, regardless of the gender dynamics involved. This realization led me to become involved with several organizations that were working to address workplace misconduct more comprehensively. I joined the board of a nonprofit that provided support and resources to victims of workplace abuse, regardless of their gender or the nature of the abuse they experienced. I also began working with employment lawyers and corporate consultants to develop better training programs and policies for companies that wanted to create genuinely safe and respectful workplace cultures. These activities were personally fulfilling, but they also had professional benefits. My reputation as someone who had successfully challenged workplace misconduct, combined with my analytical skills and industry experience, made me a valuable consultant for companies that were serious about reforming their cultures. Within 2 years of joining Alpine Axis, I was promoted to Vice President of Operations, with expanded responsibilities that included overseeing the company's workplace culture initiatives. This role allowed me to help build the kind of corporate environment I wished had existed at Kyndryl Systems. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact of my experience was the change it brought to the broader conversation about workplace harassment and corporate accountability. Sophie Tran's series about my case had been shared thousands of times and had inspired similar investigations at other publications. Her work contributed to a growing awareness that workplace abuse was a systemic problem that required systemic solutions, not just individual complaints and settlements. The success of our case also demonstrated that victims of workplace abuse could fight back effectively when they had proper documentation, legal support, and media attention. This encouraged other victims to come forward and helped establish new precedents for challenging non-disclosure agreements and corporate retaliation. Most importantly, companies began to realize that protecting abusive executives was not just morally wrong, but also financially dangerous. The reputational and legal costs of covering up misconduct had become too high to ignore, and many companies began implementing genuine reforms rather than just cosmetic policy changes. 5 years after that fateful meeting in Alicia Brent's office, I received a letter that brought the entire experience full circle. The letter was from a recent college graduate named Michael Rodriguez, who was starting his first job at a major corporation in Chicago. Michael explained that he had read about my case during a business ethics course and wanted to thank me for demonstrating that it was possible to stand up to workplace abuse without destroying one's career. Michael wrote that knowing my story had given him the confidence to recognize and report inappropriate behavior from a supervisor during his internship. His complaint had been taken seriously. The supervisor had been disciplined, and Michael had been able to transition to a full-time position without retaliation. Reading Michael's letter reminded me why I had decided to go public with my story in the first place. It wasn't about revenge against Alicia Brent or even about my own career prospects. It was about creating a workplace culture where people could do their jobs without fear of abuse, harassment, or retaliation. The letter also made me reflect on how much had changed in the 5 years since my experience at Kyndryl Systems. The conversation about workplace misconduct had evolved significantly. Companies were taking these issues more seriously, and victims had more resources and support available when they decided to come forward. But Michael's letter also reminded me that the work was far from finished. As long as there were people in positions of power who were willing to abuse that power, there would be a need for others to speak out, stand up, and hold them accountable. Today, I continue to work at Alpine Axis, where I've been promoted to Senior Vice President of Operations and Corporate Culture. The company has grown from 200 employees when I joined to over 1,500, and maintaining our ethical culture as we scale has become one of my primary responsibilities. I also continue to speak publicly about workplace harassment and corporate accountability. I've testified before legislative committees about the need for stronger workplace protection laws, and I've consulted with dozens of companies that are serious about creating respectful workplace cultures. Most importantly, I continue to receive letters, emails, and phone calls from people who are facing situations similar to what I experienced with Alicia Brent. Some are men being harassed by female supervisors, others are women dealing with male abusers, and some are dealing with harassment based on race, religion, sexual orientation, or other characteristics. In every case, I try to provide the same advice that Julian Cross gave me in that coffee shop in Capitol Hill. Document everything, find allies, gather evidence, and don't be afraid to fight back when you have a strong case. But I also try to convey something else that I learned through my experience. Standing up to workplace abuse isn't just about individual justice. It's about creating systemic change that protects future victims. When I declined Alicia Brent's proposition in her corner office, I knew that my career at Kendrick Systems was probably over. What I didn't know was that my decision to fight back would ultimately lead to a more rewarding career, meaningful relationships with other advocates for workplace reform, and the satisfaction of knowing that my experience had helped prevent other people from being victimized. I didn't seek revenge when I decided to expose Alicia's behavior. I sought truth and accountability, but if justice was the consequence of that pursuit, then I accepted it with complete peace of mind. The recording device I had carried in my pocket during those final weeks at Kendrick Systems had captured more than just evidence of harassment and retaliation. It had captured the sound of my own voice, steady and clear, saying no to someone who thought their position gave them the right to demand more than professional competence from their subordinates. That voice, amplified by journalists like Sophie Tran and investigators like Julian Cross, had become part of a larger chorus of people who refused to accept that workplace abuse was simply the cost of doing business in corporate America. And that chorus was growing louder every day. One victim, one advocate, one ethical company at a time. The transformation hadn't been easy, and it certainly hadn't been quick. But as I sat in my office at Alpine Axis, looking out at the Colorado mountains and reading thank you letters from people I had never met, I knew that the decision to fight back had been worth every difficult moment. Because in the end, silence protects the abusers, while speaking out protects everyone else. And in a choice between my own comfort and everyone else's safety, there really wasn't a choice at all.